Welcome to Season 7 of The Common Bridge, hosted by Richard Helppie, a leading analyst, philanthropist, and entrepreneur. Now expanded with healthcare, education, finance, science, and world affairs bridges, the podcast, now in its 7th season, with an audience of over 7 million worldwide, explores issues in a fiercely nonpartisan way. Find us at The Common Bridge at substack.com, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Hello, welcome to The Common Bridge. I am your host, Rich Helppie. It is 2026, and we have the honor and the privilege to begin this new year with a returning guest, the very popular professor from Southern Methodist University's Law School, Professor Anthony Colangelo. Professor, it's good to see you. How have you been?
I've been pretty well. Classes are starting up soon. I'm excited about that. I feel like I've got some nice research underway. And overall.
Well, there's few researchers as good as you. And, look, it's a very important time because right now we're in a media environment where people just don't believe the other side. And I'm in that camp. When I pick up the legacy media, be it online, be it the former print newspapers, be it the legacy networks, be it the cable channels, I kind of know what filter I'm going to get and how they're going to try to propagandize us. So, today we're going to talk about the recent assault and capture. It pertains to Venezuela. Is it legal? Is it good policy? Maybe we'll get in on that. And look, frankly, there's a lot to be concerned about here. I watched the presser, and the president and the secretaries and the head of the Joint Chiefs, they said, look, we had a successful mission into Venezuela. We took capture the president and the first lady of Venezuela. Although people are saying, well, that's not really the president, that's really a dictator. Maybe that's a topic for another day. But also the president said, hey, if you think you're going to fill that gap, we've got a second wave ready to go. And then went on to say that we, the administration, are going to be running the country, and somehow vectored over into opening restaurants in Washington, D.C., because of military boots on the ground in Washington, D.C. So a lot to unpack there and a lot to unravel. But look, when I go to news sources that celebrated the Russian hoax, that misreported about the lawfare, that turned people out into city parks on Saturday afternoons for, performative nonsense, who never investigated where all the BLM money went. It's like, I'm not going there as a place to get my news or my information. But let's see if we can talk a little bit about this. Maybe the basic question is, what happened, and is it legal what the administration did?
Yeah, it is. You're right. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because, the Republicans have a president I personally have no love for, but in this particular situation, acted completely legally. There is no question in my mind. Under any body of law, whether it's international or national. The fact of the matter is, he utilized the international law doctrine of irregular rendition, which essentially allows, cross-border kidnapping, where a criminal, perpetrates criminal activity that has effects within your territory. This is, Supreme Court precedent here, which combined a case called Alvarez versus Macain, where the court actually allowed, U.S. operatives to go outside the treaty structure, outside the, the extradition treaty we had with Mexico. So this is permissible, and there's Supreme Court precedent. There's also an old Latin doctrine called male captus benedictentis. The bad capture does not deprive the court of good detention or jurisdiction. The crime at issue, narcoterrorism. There's the Narcoterrorism Convention, UN Narcoterrorism Convention, and its jurisdictional provisions in Article 4 basically create what I would call a form of treaty-based universal jurisdiction, such that if you have custody over the accused, you have the authority to prosecute.
Maduro was captured, and he can't claim immunity. And also in the op-ed that you've authored that we will be posting as a guest column on the Common Bridge, you talk about the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, who was head, of course, of the Nazi concentration camp at Auschwitz. He was prosecuted for crimes against the state of Israel, even though Israel didn't exist when he committed his crime. Yeah. And that was, I thought, a fascinating part of history and a part of your legal research.
Well, I mean, I'll just say before that, before I get into it, I totally agree. These news sources are so unreliable. I tried to get like a real conservative take. And like, it was all about like, Joe Biden, like making I'm like, come on, your president did something good, guys. Just acknowledge it. You don't have to throw petty insults. And this is what's dominating your news outlets now. What? Like getting back at Joe Biden? Can we move on and actually get to the real issue, which is, your president took out of power a dictator. I would say a dictator, probably. It doesn't matter, actually. I mean, if he's the head of state, he's the head of state. The question is, he recognized as the head of state? We can address that in a second when we talk to the immunity issue. But, sometimes, I understand your frustration. I have it too. This is very serious stuff. And the way international law works is it's based on the practice of states. And as I mentioned in my, in my little column, this is a massive data point, massive data point for how international law evolves. It is an empirical phenomenon. And here you have a massive data point, and it's like, can't you just accept it as such and not be petty?
I could also look. I don't know if it's good policy. All right, because I'm not versed in the law or in international relationships, and I know it took a lot of people to begin this process by knocking out drug boats. And of course, there was a knee-jerk reaction that, these were fishermen. And I actually asked a lot of fishermen, how much fentanyl and cocaine do you normally take on a nighttime fishing run? And so far, the answer is none. Apparently, it's just a thing for the Caribbean. But also, during the administration between the two Trump administrations, that there was a bounty, a reward, leading to the arrest and or conviction of Nicolas Maduro, $25 million. It was done at the tail end of the Biden administration, just before Trump was inaugurated. It bumped it up from the $15 million that Trump had set in 2020. So I said, okay, there's $25 million for information leading to the arrest and conviction. Well, who was going to do the arresting and who was going to do the convicting? I don't understand that at all. What's the substance behind that?
Yeah, I think, as I sort of wrote to you a little bit earlier, the way I conceive of, this situation as being almost emblematic of, situations that have popped up really since the end of the Cold War. We have these individuals who represent a threat to the stability of the international legal system, some of whom are heads of state, some of whom are terrorists and not heads of state, or pirates, or, but they're, heads of their own little states of Al-Qaeda and, ISIS. And The question is just how do we, and this I think just is basic, first year criminal law, essentially. How do we hold them accountable? How do we deter this type of behavior? And even how do we rehabilitate? Maybe even them, who knows? But at the very least, the victims of these crimes, these awful crimes, right? Crimes against humanity. So it's not, and I think yes, Article 240 of the UN Charter says no violation of their state's territorial sovereignty. But Article 51 says you can do it in an act of collective self-defense. Now, what does collective self-defense mean? It means that we are collectively defending humanity. And we all have a maintenance, in this rule. So when Vladimir Putin invades, Ukraine, or, you've got a narco-terrorist dictator in charge, spreading drugs throughout, the continent, we all have an interest in that. And not only states, even I would say, that are directly affected, right? So there's actually two violations. One is the violation, let's say, take narcoterrorism. One is the violation to the particular state in which the drugs are shipped. But there's also a violation to the rule against narcoterrorism. And that rule, every state has an interest in maintaining. And the same would go for, Putin invading Ukraine, right? Ukraine has a claim, right? You violated our rights. But that's why I think it's perfectly legal for us to help out Ukraine. We have an interest in the maintenance of the rule that says you can't invade another country. So, when people say to me, well, things have to be proportionate. Our response has to be proportionate. I think that's absolutely wrong. These people are not idiots. They're doing their cost-benefit analysis. And they're saying, if we do X and the proportionate response is Y, we'll do X. But we need Y and Z to dissuade them, to deter them. And I think, looking back, starting, 20, 30 years, however, how we handle these individuals or groups of individuals, really, I think you can kind of get very technical. Did we bring them and give them a trial? What were the criminal charges? Were they, is this, he's in the Southern District of New York. He's going to get all the constitutional protections there are. We, acted in conformity with international law. The executive absolutely has power to do this. The executive is essentially the head prosecutor of the United States for criminal activity.
I hope they put him in a more secure place than they put Jeffrey Epstein. That it was also in federal custody at his demise. But also, the president went on to make really grandiose statements about, well, we're taking the oil, we're going to put our companies in there, and we're going to run this. And I have to admit to say, look, what boundaries do we put on saying, let's take aim at Mexico, which he kind of implied that, Mexico, you might be next. And this is not a good way to win the hearts and minds, it seems. And I know people would make the parallel. Well, Obama ordered the assassination of Osama bin Laden, but Osama bin Laden was not head of a state recognized, and was, widely associated with a criminal enterprise. But also, the Obama administration, they bombed Libya with the express purpose of taking out Gaddafi. As Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. And not to, again, Obama, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia. But we didn't take out, except for Libya, we didn't take out their heads of state.
Yeah, look, Ronald Reagan bombed Libya, killed hundreds of innocent civilians, children, Clinton stopped a genocide, probably. I mean, there was at least 10,000 deaths in the former Yugoslavia before he put Wesley Clark in charge of NATO, a multilateral force using smart weaponry so that the degree of civilian death and suffering was minimal, compared to what was coming. That the independent prosecutor for the ICTY, International Court of Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, decided, Carla Del Ponte, she decided, I'm not even going to pursue an investigation into this. Now, that may have been partly political, but the fact of the matter is that, I read all those, reports, and yeah, there was some collateral damage, but I mean, there were lawyers on the front lines making those decisions. Airstrikes are interesting, right? Obama in Syria. I think the question is, and even to get back to the Eichmann situation, going and grabbing Eichmann and bringing him to Israel for trial, it's just like, how much of the rule of law are we going to follow with the least amount of collateral damage in the form of, loss of human life and suffering? And I think you can actually do a pretty, very technical, but not super complicated, almost spectrum, along which there's full-scale military intervention, from precision bombing to going and taking the person, bringing them back to stand trial. And I would even say, and I think one option that ought to be really, really considered is trying people in their absence. I see in this day and age no reason why we should not try people in absentia. Other countries do it. If it's a question of notice that they don't know, well, a lot, again, against these particular types of criminals is very clearly spelled out in multilateral treaties that are ratified by usually somewhere around 180, 190 to 200, countries in the world. And that practice in and of itself generates custom. So you can't say, oh, I didn't know torture was illegal, right? Have their lawyers go to the courtroom. You can sit in your office in your mansion and, your lawyers can defend you or they can sit next to you. We'll do a Zoom trial, ship the evidence, put it right before the court, and that, I think, just to talk about being as neutrally legal and objective as possible, and sending also out a message, a signal. This type of behavior will no longer be tolerated. If we have to trap you in your own country with an international arrest warrant and Interpol's waiting at every airport, we'll do it.
Well, the difference here, though, okay, let's, your explanation of what international law is, right? And you're very learned on this, and I accept that, all right, that going in and apprehending Maduro, and he did not have any claim to immunity, was legal. But where do the bounds of legality end? Because now we are saying, well, we're going to occupy the country. We're going to have a say in who steps into that role, that we are going to take over their oil assets. And this seems like it's going way beyond, we've stopped a narco-terrorist after we took out their ships. And I don't know if you justify taking out the oil tankers as a means of denying them financing, but some point there has to be a boundary. And then further, if this was generated from the executive branch, our risk of one person becoming the president and saying, I'm going to deploy our military without boundaries. Now, in this instant case, I'd also point out that the Venezuelans seem to really like the idea that the U.S. military came in, as evidenced by there was less resistance than the Grenada military put up when we went into Grenada decades ago. and the celebrations that we've seen around the world from Venezuelans, particularly here in Florida. So, the question is, was it a popular good policy, but where are the boundaries of legality and the balance of powers within our Constitution?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as far as that goes, the Constitution vests the executive with the power to enforce the law. Since there's a, let's say, historical gloss on that power. And again, this is an article that I co-authored with my constitutional law professor when I was in law school on the unitary executive. And I covered the Truman administration through the George W. Bush administration at the time of the Iraq War. And it's very clear that executives on both sides have been arrogating power. The Constitution gives it to them, but they've been pushing it. And that creates a precedent, And in my view, at least, I think this was legal. I mean, this is certainly compared with, an assassination. Not to say that the assassination was wrong. I mean, I think, probably given who Osama bin Laden was and what potentially could have happened had we taken him into custody and held him to stand trial, and all the people out there willing to blow themselves up probably to get him out, I think the assassination was probably the right move.
I did speak with the first and the second person in the room with bin Laden, and not on the air, but I can tell you this, that they said it was a capture or kill mission, and they gave him like less than a second to surrender, and then they shot him. So,
if he's wearing, suicide vest.
Yeah, it was never going to be. It was never going to be a capture. Well, look, around the world, we need to keep an eye on. Say again.
I was going to just talk briefly about the immunities and the occupation.
Yes, please talk about the immunity, and then I want to wrap up with a little teaser about Iran, and then we can bring this to a close. But
I'll conclude by why I think this is important in terms of the trajectory of international law, which is your sort of boundaries, right? So just immunities real quick. Two types. One is status-based. So it would be his immunity as head of state. Now, he's no longer head of state. He's not there anymore. I think that takes care of that. I also think that, there's questions as to the legitimacy of his actual position. And these immunities, in my view, are on their last legs anyway. And not only, it only lasts as long as he is in charge, which he's not. The other type of immunity would last after he leaves office. It's called conduct-based immunity, and it only covers quote unquote official governmental acts or functions. Now, the narcoterrorism treaty of 1998, 1988, I think, prohibits this activity. So it does not qualify as a official governmental function, right? Governments are not officially narco-terrorists under international law. And I think we're also at the point where these immunities have been challenged so much over the last 20 years that they're really almost extinct, in my view. And, just quickly in terms of occupation, I think that's an exceedingly difficult question. Probably one we won't have time to talk about today. But obviously, the Bush administration could have done a much better job in Iraq. My Iraqi friend tells me they wish they did. I was at Columbia and he was married to a Kurdish woman. I wish the United States just did more. I mean, we have an obligation. If we're going to go in and remove somebody from power, we have an obligation to create a stable environment for that country, probably handing over control as soon as possible, practically possible. I guess sort of in terms of, and I also often hear people push back by saying against any sort of like intervention in another country by saying, well, it's all about the oil, or it's all about, the whatever. And that may be partly true, but it still doesn't detract, I suppose, in my view at least, from the fact that you're taking out of power a genocidal dictator. So I listened very carefully to the address that George W. Bush gave to the nation after 9/11. And at the end, it came at the end, but we are going to remove a genocidal dictator. And if the standard for doing so is that part of your motivation, or even your whole motivation, is based on a strategic national interest, and if you're going to intervene in one place, you have to intervene everywhere, then no one's going to ever do anything. It's an impossible standard to meet. And then you just have these strong men who are just killing their own people. And so, I guess, sort of when I say, like, we have to look at actually what happened. Yes, there are political motivations, but what actually did this person do? And if they actually, conducted this operation in conformity with the rule of law, they should be applauded. Because that, for international, I'll just tie it to the sort of grander trajectory of international law. That is a data point that empirically we can look at and say, aha, good. We'll base our future actions on that and, move forward where motives that may not, that maybe, let's say, more pure, prevail. Because what it does is it, I think, creates a precedent and frees states up that otherwise would not act to act. I could be wrong. That's my suspicion. My suspicion is that we have a collection of, sovereign states that are, in a system. They're trying to achieve stability. That's what the United Nations did. It did it through Article 2.4, said don't interfere with other countries' sovereignty. And the question we really have to ask ourselves right now is, when you have, gross human rights violations going on inside a state, is it okay to disrupt that peace and stability? Are we going to sacrifice fundamental human rights in order to keep the peace? And my position is we can't tolerate that. We can't tolerate it. The system will cannibalize itself from the inside out.
I appreciate you bringing this to our audience, because I remember the first time we had you on, and I was greatly relieved to know that many of these matters of international law had been discussed, codified, settled, and people played within those boundaries. It was not a crisis that we didn't know what was going to happen next. And as you were explaining that part, I thought, well, it's too bad that we don't have a press that brings in someone from the other side of the aisle that says, look, we're really happy Maduro's gone. We'll be meeting with the president this afternoon, and we're going to be talking about next steps, because we don't want the next steps to be, beyond the boundaries. But instead, it was just so predictable. Like, okay, they're going to bring out the same sorry losers that are going to make the same sorry complaints to the same sorry audience that is bought into this hook, line, and sinker, versus stepping back and saying what's really going on. And as I said at the top of the show, and I'll wrap up with it, that we have to be careful that we use the incredible power of the United States within the boundaries of our Constitution and international law. And the president, who serves at the pleasure of the people, needs to stay within those boundaries. And I am satisfied that on the taking out of the boats and the arrest of Maduro, great. And now the question is, what's next? And when you tell me you're running a country, taking their oil, oh, by the way, restaurants are opening in Washington, and that's all linked in there some way, I think it's a really good time for us to be vigilant. And I would encourage people to come to real sources like you, Professor Colangelo, and to many of the good writers at Substack and other independent news organizations.
It's frankly, it's childish, immature, counterproductive, distracting, sound bites,
Yes.
taunting. It's taunting. It creates a festering, corrosive political environment in which real progress, if it is made, can't be appreciated because everybody's got to throw their insult, across the aisle. And it's sad because these are, opportunities where, as I said, could have a really significant ripple effect going forward. But if they're going to be plagued by taunts and, tweets and, it's just like it's distracting for any audience, right? Their, personalities come into play and they don't need to. They don't need to.
Look, at the last State of the Union address, the president said, I'm not going to appeal to the Democrats because there's nothing I can say or do that's going to make them happy, or words to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very dangerous about not reaching out to everybody. Just prior to Donald Trump being elected again to office, we had supposedly a president that was going to unify us, and instead said his mission was wiping out the Trump movement known as MAGA. That's not unification when you demonize people like that. And the sad part is there are people now so bought in that they can't get past their own hate and their own brainwashing to step back and look. It's not saying they need to become a supporter of one side or the other, but at least recognize that there is middle ground. Let me have Professor Colangelo, you've been very generous with your time. I'll give you the final comment and then wrap up.
I think I would just say, I throughout my career have had mentors, very conservative and very liberal, and the ones that were the best. My judge I clerked for in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Winter, was a Reagan nominee, and my constitutional law professor in law school, my international law professor in law school, some of the people that I worked with at Columbia and Harvard and Yale, they were curious. This is what I tell my children, actually. The sign of true intelligence is curiosity. It's not certainty. The brain is like any other muscle. Obviously, but when you're curious and you're open to different perspectives, your sort of worldview expands in ways that can synthesize, other people's ideas and perspectives and hopefully reach a common ground. If you've automatically decided without, as you say, hearing the other side, your mind shuts down, and your ideas don't grow. And, then simple little things that could be opportunities for grand compromise don't even get started. The conversation never even begins, which is, as I said, it's just unfortunate.
Well, look, I don't think truer words have ever been spoken, and that is our mission on the Common Bridge, to get people to talk, to understand it's not this polarized situation that we're being presented with by the two established political parties and by the legacy press. I encourage everybody reach out to those that they may not agree with an open mind and a kind heart. And with our guest today, Professor Anthony Colangelo, great to have you back on the Common Bridge, sir. This is your host, Rich Helpy, signing off on the Common Bridge.
Thank you for joining us on the Common Bridge, where we continue to seek clarity across divided lines. Subscribe and support the Common Bridge on Substack, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, we invite you to stay informed, stay engaged, and help build a bridge of common understanding.